message section now. Now there's a lot of confusion about data. But before I start, I heard what Tangaza Stanislaus said in terms of he's not an expert, and I just have to warn you, neither am I. We are constantly learning together in South Africa and with other entities across the world. And we've realized that the only thing that makes us strong is that we keep on sharing. And I hope that very soon we get to hear from your side exactly what you've done, because I think what is very important is that there is recipes for everything. And there's a recipe for data management as well, a recipe for implementation, etc. But all contexts are different, and therefore there might always be variation which we can learn from. So I'm really looking forward to, from your side, if you can share at one stage as well. Right, now just briefly, I'm going to talk about what is open data. I'm going to also speak about what's open data within open science, and then also talk about libraries and open data, specifically focusing on data repositories. I'm not going to talk about linked data, because that on its own is an hour and a half session. Absolutely incredible, exciting stuff happening with linked data. But I'm going to focus on just open data in general. And please tell me at any given point if you want me to go deeper into certain areas, please do so. Because I wasn't sure about the level where you're at currently in your country or at institutions with data management. Hello, Joseph. All right, let's continue. Now, there's a number of terms being thrown around: open access, open science, big data, linked data, fairer data, government data, personal data. And people use these concepts actually interchangeably, which is not 100% correct, but each and every one of them has got a very specific context in when it's being used. And you would have picked up on this as well, and thank you. This is the open access celebration on your side, and I think it's very appropriate, and therefore at least you already have the understanding that open data is but one aspect of the larger open science environment, which is this. Now, this is a schematic illustration that allows you to, first of all, it serves as a brilliant view of the various areas that one can focus on within open science. I don't have a pointer, and I don't think you can see my mouse pointer, but you will see that on the left, it's open science. Now, where libraries have really, I think, made great strides is in the open access movement, which you'll see is this on the second tier right on top, open access. And there's many parts to open access that we've already worked on, defining open access, establishing open access initiatives at our various institutions, gold, green, and now recently you've got the diamond, or I can't remember what exactly, I think it's diamond, it's platinum, also that somebody said also. But that's got a lot to do with the access to the actual research object. But next in line is open data, and you would notice there's a lot more aspects to open data than, for instance, open access. And also, just a reminder, I have to tell you, and I mean, obviously you probably know this, open science does not refer to science in terms of pure science versus humanities. Open science is basically the comprehensive knowledge and scholarship area. So open data, there's again, it's you've got things like open big data, open data definition, open data journals, standards, etc., etc. But I would like to invite everyone at one stage, and you can see there's the open data in context. There's a number 6 to it. Go down to the references and go and have a look at this page, because I think this page is very key to first of all, allowing us to understand where in the hierarchy are we actually busy with when it comes to open science and what is still required. And each of these elements that you see is actually linked to resources and training opportunities. So even within open data, you'll find there's a basic open data course that you can follow, or you can complete, and you, in certain cases, you get certification. I haven't gone through all of them, but again, I urge everyone to follow this logic. This is called, I think they call this the Foster hierarchy, for you to then be able to go and work through open science in a logical and constructive way. Now, open data, people have different approaches to how to define it. The Open Knowledge Foundation, which is most probably one of the key stakeholders in the open science, open data environment, says that open data are the building blocks of open knowledge. Open knowledge is what open data becomes when it's useful, usable, and used. Now, if we go back, and I would assume that most of you are librarians, even all of you, meaning that you would understand that we talk about the DIKW or DIKIW, or various variants to the DIKW paradigm, which is data, information, knowledge, wisdom. So knowledge, obviously, is, I think this is what we are trying to achieve as librarians. We're not forcing the world to go open access. I wish. But that's not our goal. Our goal is to have knowledge accessible to everyone. That includes all types of knowledge, all materials, all aspects of it, and not just journal articles, because yes, we often come from university environments where we know the cost of getting access to information, what it costs, and obviously what's the implied barrier to information for people outside of our institutions. But I really, really like the second approach, which defines it as a two-layer, well, it's defined in two layers. First of all, open data is first of all a philosophy, and secondly, a practice. And that, when I saw this originally, I thought, well, this is really good, because we often, as librarians, we struggle in our institutions, and I'm not sure whether it's the same at your institutions, but we struggle with getting mandates in place, getting the policies in place, in order to, as enablers for what we're trying to achieve. And then I realized afterwards, but it's because our institution does not follow the philosophy. The philosophy is missing, meaning that there's not a higher consciousness about certain things, or there's a lack of willingness to participate in a higher level consciousness when it comes to open access, or open science rather. Therefore, our practice often feels the pinch, because we don't have the enablers to support these processes. But I really like, and I want you to consider the two levels, the philosophy and the practice part of everything that we do. But now the question is, well, we all know what data is. Data is any building block that forms part of, and in specific contexts can become information, which can be used, kind of knowledge, etc. But why do they call it open data? The open part actually requires three, in some frameworks you'll see four, but for most of the part you'll see there's three requirements. It means that data has got to be available and accessible. And there's also criteria. The availability means that it must be available as a unit, as an entity that you can download or use. There should be no access cost. There might be a reproduction cost, but that's not on, the onus is not on the end user to actually pay that reproduction cost, except if he wants to. For instance, if you want to print the data set, for argument's sake. Then also the compliance to certain standards for transferability and usability might also cause barriers in terms of availability and access. So immediately you can see that this is definitely the bottom line. It needs to be freely accessible in a manner that's easy for everybody to use and reuse. Going back to, well, now going on to reuse and redistribution, there should be statements clearly indicating the rights that a person has when it comes to how to use it, and if you're allowed to redistribute it, and also both on a human and a machine level. And there's a lot I can say about this, but I'm going to quickly go to, not now, later on, to Creative Commons, which will, I think, answer some of the questions relating to the machine readability versus human readability and redistribution. The third aspect of the openness is that everyone must be able to use, reuse, and redistribute, meaning that it's universal participation. And more so, again, I don't know about your environment. We have 26 public universities, and the public university part means that we get funded by the government to some extent. And quite often, that funding, we call it tax funded, means that by implication, it was paid for by your communities, your citizens, therefore it must be shared with your citizens and freely accessible because they've already paid for the research through the taxes. Another definition includes and makes a clear distinction between the two levels of openness. First of all, the legal open side. Sorry, there's noise coming from, if you can just mute, possible. Just some noise coming from the one area. So the one level has got to be legally open, and secondly, it's got to be technically open. Legally open, again, we go back to compliance and we talk about copyright, we call it use, reuse, distribution, etc. The technically open means that a machine should be able to understand it and be able to get it and be able to use it. It sounds easier than it is in many cases. But so that's the open part in data, and I'm not going to go into what's data because I think that's part of what we basically focus on. But the question is, when we talk about data in a library perspective, what data do we really refer to? And I think there's many instances that one can consider, what actually is the data that we're talking about. Now, at the start of the session, I had Mr. Stanislaus talk about, in my mind, what I understood to be research data, which I will then talk to later on, because I think that is a key focus area for academic libraries. It's the research data, but there's also other types of data that one can consider, including our very own metadata. So if there are any catalogers amongst you, you are my most favorite people. I love catalogers because I think they've got the most difficult task of all, especially when it comes to semantic web, etc. But that's also a different conversation. And then you'll find that often various sites will talk about differences between the data types. So you've got cultural data, scientific data, financial data, human development data, statistical, environmental, and the list continues. But at academic institutions, and specifically from a librarian perspective, I think we see all of it as scientific data. We don't make a distinction in terms of what area of data this is covering. It's rather a case of, is this the research data, and research data meaning not the basic raw data, but rather the anonymized and converted data that's used as it's been interpreted as part of the research creation process. So we see the scientific data. Doesn't matter which area it comes from. But the real reason, and I listened to the opening remarks, it's Open Access Week, and I'm coming back to the philosophy. Why are we doing this? Well, first of all, you have to ask yourself, what's your institutional mandate? Because without that institutional mandate, any endeavor, and I'm sure if there's any library directors in this group, they would know how difficult it is to get the support for certain initiatives if there's no mandate that can support it or warrants it. So, what is our institutional mandate? And does it actually speak to open data and open access and open science? And then also, what is your institutional philosophy? And I made the differentiation because I realized at Rhodes, we have a challenge. And the challenge being is that, yes, we readily agree to sign something like the Berlin Declaration. But when it comes to practice, we've got academics hiding behind academic freedom. I thought that's very odd. So we have a mandate, which we can't enforce. This is not good. And that non-enforceability of it actually speaks to the institutional philosophy. So a lot of, sorry, is that word spelled correctly? Philosophy, why does it look so odd? Oh, anyway. Then we also have you have to ask, is the mandate aligned to the open science movement, which includes, for instance, do we truly believe in open science in terms of the social benefits that it brings, scientific benefits, and the benefits in terms of innovation, discovery, not just at the institutional level, but for the common person out there, common referring to anybody that's part of the public as well. It's not, so data is not held by a select few for their own enrichment, it's to the betterment of our environments. And this directly speaks to, I think, the institutional's vision to be socially responsible and socially relevant. Then also in South Africa, what has happened is that one of our key research funders, the National Research Foundation, have now dictated to us that any publicly funded research, publicly funded through the NRF, the National Research Foundation, has to be open access. And secondly, the data set that goes with the research, or data sets, also has to be made accessible for a number of reasons, which I'll go into now. Why would researchers want their data to be out there? Well, obviously you want accessible data. It lends to transparency, and it helps with the validity, determining the validity of research. Specifically, if you're to determine the rigor, scientific rigor that's been employed within your research process, and your research findings can therefore be verified and validated. And it also fosters collaboration. So it's quite important for researchers. Now, whether this researcher is from your country or out there, it's actually all the same, because they want access to data. And what is quite nice, you don't have to redo certain research in order to get data that might be repurposed for another research process. Then, very important in, I think, the African environment, you want data to be accessible because our governments are not always the best in the world. However, having looked at what's happening in Britain and America the past few years, I think we often have the better presidents in many cases. But there is an added aspect of transparency that's brought by data being available. This includes, for instance, data about your human development index, poverty indexes, wellness indexes, etc. And then it also serves as a control measure, because any person can take data and then also act on it and determine if government or government body is actually filling its mandate. There's other reasons as well, which I'm not going to go into. I mean, there's so many reasons why you want open data. But for me personally, I think what's most important, and this is often not listed anywhere, it adds value to the Africanization of what's available on the internet. A lot of countries, and I think yours as well, and by South Africa, we talk about decolonization of the internet. I don't use the word decolonization. I think it's a very destructive view, and a lot of people in South Africa has interpreted that as removing something, but not replacing it with something. Whereas Africanization, for me, speaks directly to ensuring that there's sufficient and correct information about Africa available on the internet at the same level as any other information about any other country. So it's important that both the research product or output, whether it be an article, a thesis, etc., be available, but at the same time also the supporting evidence that goes with it, because I think also it adds validity. As I said earlier on, it adds validity to the research, but more so because we know that African researchers have a difficulty to get the research published as compared to the European or American counterparts, because there's an inherent bias. But with any of these research data sets being available, you have the evidence to counter certain arguments. So look, you can validate it, you can reproduce it. Therefore, you cannot question the scholarly process or the scholarly integrity. So this, to me, is actually very important, the Africanization of internet. There's a lot of information available on open data, and there's a lot of resources. Again, you can go to these links. A lot of the basics, and then it comes to policy design, Policies is very intricate because a policy at the institution level has to consider a number of other policies. For instance, our open access policy had to consider the financial policy for research publications. It had to consider the research agenda. It had to consider the copyright, etc. And the standards is also very important because I think this is also where we often, we being not European, I should say, we are quite often understaffed to take on certain tasks. And where we find in America and Europe, they've got like 5 people for one job. We've got 1 person for 5 jobs, and often we don't comply to standards, not because we don't want to, not because we don't think we need to, but merely the fact that we find that we are understaffed and overworked. There's also a lot of information on data training, and I said I wanted to warn the librarians ahead of time that venturing into an open data environment means that you're also becoming a teacher. As you would already found if you went through the open access process, whereby we have to teach your communities, that's the scholars. Kindly recap after you're done. Right, there's also the scholars that we have to train and show them how to use not just our resources, but how to use the resources that we make available to facilitate dissemination of information. Then the rights to information. We have seen this often popping up in various forms, and this is quite often legislative in nature. But at the same time, there's also the privacy laws that we have to consider, and again, I'm going to mention this later on. Then there's civic engagement and advocacy. And as you can see, immediately, just by looking at these 8 blocks, you'll see that the role of the librarian in each and every one of those. And when we embark on open data initiatives, we'll have to go through and work through all of these areas. It's not just a quick implementation. Right. What is also important is that with any open science aspect, and I've mentioned some of this, is that there's a FAIR principles, but it's also the FAIR principles, meaning FAIR, but with the /O, and the O normally talks about open. So I'm just going to go through this again, and you can, on the right, you can see the compliance, and this is why I've added this slide, because what is meant by findability, and I think this is often we use terminology, but we don't check what it actually means and how can we tick it off in a box. So you've got findability. Well, first of all, the resource needs to be uploaded to a public repository, not limited to the institution or no access to it. And the metadata assigned to it is globally unique and requires a persistent identifier. So just in terms of findability, you already have 2 areas you've got to check, but actually more. If you consider, if you really go into the F1, F2 level, you'll see there's actually a lot more. Accessibility again, it's not just making it accessible, but making it accessible for a long term. So you've got preservation challenges that will pop up and can be downloaded and understood by both humans and computers. So your preservation is actually key in terms of accessibility. And I think a lot, and we've done it. At Rhodes University, we have neglected our preservation part of this. Interoperability, that's something that's very close to what I do often. A resource needs to be uploaded to a repository that is interoperable with other platforms. But again, what does it mean, interoperable with other platforms? Hence, we looked at when we made decisions as to which platform to use, we also considered the various interoperability standards and functions that's required. Then the repository metadata schema maps to or implements the CG core metadata schema. Basically what it says, it should match DC, which in Dublin Core, for those of you, if you're using Dublin Core, I'm not too fond of, which is unfortunate for our repository, because I think there's a lot more we can do with if we go beyond Dublin Core. And metadata use standard vocabularies and or ontologies. This is where we're going to come into linked data, which I'm not going to address today because this in itself is a fantastic, fantastically exciting, but also a very focused area that one needs to speak to. Reusability, the metadata released with a clear and accessible usage license, Creative Commons, and metadata about data and data sets are richly described with plurality of accurate and relevant attributes. It sounds like an incredible job, but I think we already do it. We do our best to describe the metadata, or to create metadata that optimally describes the data set that we are working with. So this is the FAIR principles, and if you add the O, then you have FAIR principles, which is then open. But now we often get the question, sorry, I'm just going to take a sip of coffee. When we talk about data, I would talk about all data. Now, there's certain data considerations. And I think I've actually got my two slides mixed up. This is still on the previous, apologies. This one slide, this one should have gone be one back. But just to show you, in terms of Elsevier, the data search, they also have a very, very good expression of the process, where you can look at the saved, meaning it's preserved, stored, the shared, meaning it's citable, discoverable, and accessible, and the trusted side of it, reusable, reproducible, reviewed, and comprehensible. And all of this needs to integrate between different systems and domains and stakeholders. Only then do you have a successful data repository. Right, now we're going back to data considerations. Well, there's many things when it comes to data considerations. Does it include all data? That depends from institution to institution and your mandate. We have vast sets of data that we're not going to release. There's certain conditions that we're not going to release it on, which I'll talk to now. But it's part of the challenges. So some of the considerations you have to take when it comes to data, we'll also have to consider not just the data type or the nature of the data, but external to the actual data, including, and we all know this, and it usually pops up first in any list of challenges, it's the cost, infrastructural, including the platform. Just as a matter of interest, we use Figshare as our research data management repository. Also, we use Figshare for our open education resources repository. There's implementation costs, there's maintenance costs, and there's training, and the training never stops. And it might seem, oh, but training, what do you mean by training? Well, you need to train people to obviously be able to maintain this environment. You need to train people to be able to, but therefore your catalogers at least will know how to be able to describe these data sets optimally and correctly. You need to train your end user on how to use it. You need to train your end user or your repositor in which is the best Creative Commons license or license to apply when it comes to use and reuse. And you've got to train your library staff on being able to standardize and work with these data sets. I mean, there's so many hidden costs associated with training, or many areas in training alone. Another challenge, policies. First of all, Rhodes Library, Rhodes University, we have an open access policy, which basically states that, yes, it's a lovely idea. We love it, but we cannot enforce it. That's how I see it, from my experience with the behaviors of the academics. And that brings me back to, does our philosophy fit our practice? So open access, I have a question to this, but you do need a policy. And so we are also developing a research data management policy. And for each of those aspects that I've shown you with the regional foster hierarchy, you'll have to go and design or repurpose your policy or amend your policy to fit that environment. Because the open access is very focused on certain material types or information sources, whereas open data is obviously even more focused and very specific, quite often research data. Our policies for dissemination, and then also policies for preservation. And as I said, that's where we fell flat, preservation area. One thing I've mentioned now, I think 3 or 4 times already, that's the attribution. Under which license should something be made available? And I would like to urge each and every institution that's represented here today to at least send 1 or 2 people on Creative Commons training course. There's a lot of free courses, not a lot of them, sorry. There's very, very good courses that one can attend, and specifically if you come from an African country or a developing country, quite often you will not have to pay for it. But I think it's critically important because the Creative Commons is the one way in which you can address the expression of use and reuse. Not just the expectation on the creator side, but also the expectation on the institutional side. We have found that the Creative Commons greatly increased our understanding, not just of the copyright legislation, but the practicality of copyright restrictions, including other forms of intellectual property. But any author or creator of a data set should, in as much as with journal articles, etc., should give a clear statement of who owns the copyright. Now, in South Africa, the creator, not the institution, the creator holds the copyright according to our copyright law. And if your law is anything like ours, stemming from a very old British version, then it's probably very similar. But Creative Commons does not displace or replace copyright. It actually complements it, and it complements it beautifully, in that through the Creative Commons, you can provide it doesn't change the copyright holder's intention with in terms of holding on to his copyright. It actually just allows him to stipulate what is the limitations that people can apply when it comes to use and reuse. That's what's been missing, I think, not just in our data environment, but in our other open access or open science areas, including, you would have noticed on my presentation, the very first slide contained a Creative Commons license saying that anybody is allowed to reuse this as long as they attribute. The reason why this is important is part of the openness requires a statement, and on 2 levels, and I spoke about the human and the machine level. At the human level, something that is understood. So if you go to Creative Commons, you'll see something like CC BY, meaning that, yeah, it's a Creative Commons attribution license. But you also then have to ensure that it's machine readable. Therefore, you would have in your metadata must probably a CC-BY -INT4, something like that license, which is then understood by machines when it comes to information dissemination and retrieval, and specifically portals. So if anything, if there's one thing I would like people to take away today, at least, is the Creative Commons and the incredible use across an array of services within the library, not just limited to open data. So please take time and hopefully, there can be a lot more focus on the use of Creative Commons licenses. Now, again, the question was, are we talking about all data? No. There's certain limitations, and one has to understand that, as with normal research, there's an ethical process that needs to be followed, and data has to follow exactly the same process. There's a legal framework that you have to comply with, ethical framework, and there's also a part of the legal framework is the privacy part of it. So in South Africa, we now have a POPI Act, POPI, which is the Protection of Personal Information Act. And we have to, ensure that that is abided to. But considering that this is not normally the library's role, because the ethics committees that does the research ethic clearance should actually watch out for this as well. So one of the concerns that was raised with the library is that, but who are you to tell us, or who are you to act as a gatekeeper when it comes to ethics on research outputs? I said, well, we're not. If we receive something, we assume it's gone through the ethical processes, therefore we can actually make it accessible. So one has to also draw lines at times and make sure that unnecessary responsibilities are not placed on the library. The GDPR is similar to the POPI Act, but that's for European. And then also for protection. In as much as we don't allow certain information, and I'm sure you would have similar cases, that where research output would not be made accessible in order to protect something specifically. I'm not just talking about humans like children. I'm also talking about, in our case, rhinoceros, and I think you've got a similar problem. You would want to protect, and therefore I'm not going to make the data available, except if the data can be anonymized and stripped off all of the identifying information that could have jeopardized that poor rhino's life. So there's those considerations as well. Now, what's the role of the library? First of all, acting as advocates, and you've done this already in many ways in terms of open access, but we have to become advocates for open science. So we have to understand that we are not just looking at very specific data elements, we are looking for knowledge to be accessible globally to everyone without a barrier. And that is part of your vision, your institutional vision, or your departmental vision within your institution, as long as it obviously underscores or supports the mandate of the institution. Another key role for the library is to provide the actual virtual space. And this means that we have to fork out the money for the cost to enable and provide necessary infrastructure. We also have to look at compliance, specifically with standards and mostly with metadata standards, but also with other standards like file formats, etc., because you also have to consider preservation. And you also have to ensure that you've got knowledgeable staff that supports this virtual space. So this is very key. Then also as drivers, because quite often, I don't know about your institutions, but from our many cases in Africa, the libraries are the first to start with certain initiatives, including open access. And now we've seen it again with research data management, where we were the drivers. We initiated the process on campus. So we started. And if a public librarian thinks that they don't have any role to play in this, I actually think they've got a critical role to play in this, because as a change catalyst, a library can allow for community data to be shared, and also to be able to assist the community in preserving data that's part of the community sciences. So we're looking at now extending both our repository, institutional repository, and our data repository to include aspects of community science. And we have a role to play, because obviously more so your community might not be perfect researchers, but we have a lot of retired researchers in the area, and they've got very specific processes they've got to follow. Therefore, I think their data is very good. Then the support, which is most probably the most difficult one, because you have to train, and you've got to train, you've got to train. Together with advocacy, training is most probably the most lengthy process, because you've got to go back every time and get commitment from the academics to do certain things. You've got to train them how to use the system, train community members, and then on top of your school, you've got to provide support. And the support is not just for the platform, but also for the object being created. Then, another part of the library is to enact this, I should rather have said not enacted partnership, but rather to stimulate or garner partnerships. So within communities, a public library or an academic library can play a critical role in establishing partnerships, specifically, well, I think mostly with NGOs, also with governmental, obviously, and you see it further down government, also private entities and individuals. But I also want to show you that we've gone at a consortium level in South Africa with research data, which I'll show later on. And I think also it's appropriate because this is also the Kenya Library Association. Apologies, just a second. So there's a lot of things to consider. But then the next question would be, well, how do you implement a data management policy? And here is a research data management process in 4 phases. I think it was quite well done. First of all, the strategy, policy, procedure, and infrastructure needs to be in place. Then the second phase, awareness creation, skills development, repository content development. Phase 3, management of active data, and phase 4 is data selection and preservation. 4 phases, but an incredible amount of work goes into this. Again, you can read, all of these materials are referenced, and you can go and read in the original article what the rest of the article said about this. Well, I also want to draw your attention to the report, the state of open data, and histories and horizons, and you can have a look at what is the general state of open data in the world. Now, I just want to run through research data management at Rhodes for a second, but also consider that we have what we refer to as a Rhodes Digital Commons. The Rhodes Digital Commons is a virtual space which includes our institutional repository, which in itself includes both research outputs and archival materials, which we refer to as digital humanities nowadays. Then we have research data and open education resources repository, and we have hosted journals, and we are now moving towards hosted books and hosted conference papers. All of that is our Rhodes Digital Commons, but they're all different data elements. Therefore, we have different infrastructure and platforms for each of these. So, for argument's sake, an institutional repository would be on Vital, and that's got specific schemas and standards. The research data and open education resource repository, that's a different repository, different standards, different schema, hosted journals, etc. I mean, you get the idea. Then we also have the National Research Data Portal. This is not a duplication of our materials on a national level. This is basically just a central portal through Figshare that pulls the information from the various participating institutions in South Africa, and you can go to a single point and search for research data sets, in this case, across all of the institutions or participating institutions in South Africa. And maybe that's something else that you can also consider as a library consortium as well. How can we not just implement research data management at an institutional level, but how can we also enable this at a national level, at least from whether it's a portal, whether it's support. All right, that's the, yeah, also links are clickable and you can go and find some of them. As I say, Asante, support from Rhodes University, Kenya Library Association, specifically Agaba Stanislaus, and attendees of the session. There's a lot more than I can say, but I've actually kept it as simple as possible. And the reason being is that it's a lot to actually take in, but some of you might also be developed further than what we are potentially. But what I would like to also suggest is within your Kenya Library Association is that you create a community of practice. And that community of practice can then talk to each other, because I think that's, again, that's where we fell flat in South Africa, that our professional library association, they're often the last to be involved in certain things. So we have national conversations, which we then add later on to the national professional body, which should not be the case. So I was really pleased to see that your library association was actually the actor, enabler of this conversation, because this would not have happened in South Africa. So you are definitely one ahead of us in that case. But please, you can email and you can link up in LinkedIn. You can phone me. I can also point you to experts in certain areas, like Sam Simango at Stellenbosch University, who is brilliant at policy design for research data management. Then also there's Wouter Klapwyk at Stellenbosch, who's also the best in big data management. Considering that I just spoke about data, I did not go into details of big data versus other data, because also I think that's also part of another conversation. I really hope that what I've mentioned here today helps you and stimulates your institutions into action. But know that any person who ventures on this road, a lot of reading, a lot of introspection, I'm not talking about introspection, I'm talking about the institutional introspection, where I had to consider, what is my institution's real philosophy? Not the one they state in paper. I want to see the philosophy in action. And that speaks to me the true nature of a man, the true nature of an institution. If these things go well and easy, I believe the soul of this institution is actually well established. So from my side, thank you so much. I'm sure there's possible questions. I hope I can answer them. I'll try my best.
Thank you very much, Wynand. And thank you very much, Stanlas, for starting off the session. This is Joel Nakitare from Rongo University. Colleagues, I want to welcome you for a few minutes. If there's anyone who has a question or comment, and as you prepare to have the questions, you can type them in the chat. I'll be able to pick them. Wynand can also pick them. Allow me to say that yes, we all agree that there's need to manage our research data and possibly make it open. But as a country and as universities in Kenya, many of our institutions have not yet institutionalized the research data management. And therefore, this was actually already one step ahead, because we are talking of opening up the data. But as a matter of fact, many of our universities are not providing the research data management services. But there's always a starting point, and we thought this could be a starting point for the conversation. I'm glad the presentation has provoked many of us to think of a community of practice that we can keep sharing till we find a basis. But I think it is upon the librarians to offer this direction. And I really want to thank the presenter for the good presentation and the provocation presentation he has given us. So in case there's anybody with a question, a comment, you can type or raise your hand. You unmute yourself and we'll allow you to unmute yourself and raise your question. My co-host, Stan, if you have anything, you can also still comment, but thank you very much. Any question?
Thank you very much, Joel, and thank you very much, Van der Walt. And this to us has opened up so much in terms of our awareness as far as the world of data is concerned. I am involved, I'm writing my research on data literacy, and my aim is to develop a framework, a data literacy framework for African libraries, or libraries in Africa, particularly academic libraries. And one of the things that I have come across is, or what I'm coming across, is the need for one capacity building that is among librarians as far as data is concerned, data literacy is concerned, and secondly, the whole idea about infrastructure in our respective institutions, particularly if library is the one to take over. What's your take as far as capacity building is concerned? I know information literacy came in and we managed to fidget around with some trainings and people picked it up and that was able to be rolled out. But when it comes to data, there are some elements, particularly that are touching statistical interpretations of data and so forth. Do you think we must go to that level, particularly of training librarians in terms of data literacy, statistical analysis of data on a higher level, for example, with the use of Python, R, and so forth? Should we go to that level, or the basics are just enough for us on the continent?
That is most probably one of the most stunning questions I've ever heard. and the reason is that I fully agree with you, and I think your research topic is spot on. And a lot of what we've learned is that we assume certain things. as librarians, we assume that we are literate. We assume that we understand information. We assume that we can answer all questions. In the end, I think the only assumption that's really true is that we can point people in the right direction when it comes to information. But what you're referring to now is a whole new level, which I completely support and agree with, and I think we have to definitely focus on this, because you need data scientists as part of your data team. The person does not have to be a librarian. The person doesn't have to work in the library, but maybe have a team on campus where you have a librarian together, with a data scientist, with other people. Form a cohort that can actually support your requirements. Having said that, however, I do believe in that we have to follow the library carpentry processes, whereby the future needs is that we will have to start looking at data mining, data manipulation, data extraction, not just from our own data sets, but from other places. I mean, I often present on linked data, and I've realized that the skills required, and specifically the software, the knowledge of software and the knowledge of programming languages are becoming more and more important to librarians to function. So to this end, we also have a digital scholarship unit at Rhodes Library. This digital scholarship unit's intention is to support the whole of the research process. Now, we've only started about a year and a half ago, and we are still learning. And we are not where you just said in terms of being able to assist with using certain data analysis tools. But we have employed currently, our scholarly communications person is a person who's done a PhD in another science, but also has a library degree. Therefore, that person understands data manipulation, data questioning, etc. So I agree with you. I think part of you call it data literacy, which I think is really nice. However, I also shy away from any form of literacy because it's got a negative connotation. I'm not sure whether it's in your country similar. But first of all, we cannot just preach and not practice. So I think you are spot on. We need to ensure that we have not just the skills, we need to go above the minimum expectation in order to actually bring up the expectations to your community's expectations to where you are at, and not try to solve So, but basically what I'm saying is, I think through your process, what you mentioned, the library's relevance will increase substantially. And also in terms of research support, we know that a lot of researchers don't have the time anymore to do some things. So there's a whole research support process that's actually missing, that the library should step up and take over in certain areas, or at least support in certain areas, together with the research office, together with postgraduate support centers, etc. It is a collaborative effort between a number of entities on campus. But I agree completely that we have to up our own skills considerably. Our catalogers have to know XML, for instance. Our catalogers need to understand ontologies, potentially even create an ontology if required, and need to understand linked data. And I'm talking about catalogers, never mind research support staff. We are getting there, but we're not where I would like us to be. And I think it's a fabulous question. I'm really looking forward to your research output, because I think it's something that we can all use. We've been so focused on thinking that we have to supply the means to do information literacy training for other people. And I think I said in my presentation about introspection, I think you've done the introspection to say, you know what, we need the skills in order to be able to fulfill the service. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Any other participant who has a question?
Rolex Ambogo.
Anybody who has a question? Rolex, yes, go ahead. Rolex? Rolex, were you asking a question? Joel, are you able to see if there is any question on the chats, kindly?
Hello?
Yes. Okay, ask.
Yes, I'm Rolex from Kenya. First, I want to thank Mr. Wynand so much for the awesome presentation. I have a concern to make. I'm a librarian, though working as a private librarian, and currently I'm doing a write-up on my services. I'm doing a service that is called School Library Outreach Program, and my main target are schools, network of schools. Though I haven't registered it, and I've seen some of the legal processes that I need to undergo to register it. I've identified some few schools that are currently benefiting from this program, and I will request Mr. Wynand kindly to share at length what are some of the compliances that I can put in place so that it is a success in promoting literacy in my network schools, and how I can also get some partners who I can work with to promote this service.
All right, Rolex, thank you for the question. I think I'm just trying to understand something. Are you saying that you are not currently affiliated to any research institution, and therefore you need to ensure that you comply with your research process? That's what I understood. Just tell me if that's correct or not.
Yes, what I mean is this. It's a program that was certified by Kenya National Library Services under their charter, and it started picking up, but I haven't registered it so far. It is not licensed, but there are some schools that have effected it, and it is picking up well. Now, my concern was I need to come up with a write-up, a proposal on how best I can offer this service, because I'm also targeting to bring on board some partners who can help me run this initiative. And I wanted to do this, though I haven't registered it yet. Can it be possible?
The only way I can respond to that is it depends on the ethical processes required. And you mentioned a couple of things. So first of all, as a library association, what I understood now is that there's also some projects that's run on national level, which you are part of. Therefore, the compliance would have to come from so the ethical compliance will have to come from that entity. And that ethical compliance obviously includes the legislative framework of the country. I saw somebody mentioning the Kenyan Act earlier on, Kenya Data Protection Act. And more so when you work with schools and within school libraries, I think it's very important because there's a lot of privacy laws when it comes to working with children and ethical issues. But I think from a funder perspective, if you're looking for partners to fund, again, they will have different requirements, and that might be different from funder to funder. But there is a lot of research data management plans that you can have a look at. Now, what is happening in South Africa, as part of your submission to do research, you already have to state your research data management plan. So even before they can fund research, they ask, what is your research data management plan? This is on top of already what they're asking in terms of the ethical clearances of your research and other things. Now, whom are you affiliated to? Who's going to be the partners? Who's going to fund this, etc. So it largely depends from institution to institution, entity to entity, but all of those things are within a specific legal framework of the country. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you very much, Wynand. I know we'll follow up with the Rolex, and if there's need that we can still support him, I think we should be able
Sure.
to do that from this end.
Sure.
There's a question from Elisha Ngiga asking for Africanization, a bit of elaboration on Africanization of internet. I think you had already indicated that is on a light note, and it's not common, but indeed we should do that. But he's seeking for more clarification.
Sure.
So if you can take maybe 1 or so minutes, and then we wind up. As I said, it is a beginning of a very long debate, and we'll still organize more of this so that we be able to come on board and also indeed Africanize the internet. Thank you. So if you can give a bit of more elaboration. If there's any other burning questions, let's have it maybe the last one, then we just finish. Thank you, Karibu.
Thank you, and thank you so much for the question. This is one of my areas of passion. A lot of people find it very funny that an ancestor of colonialism is very much for Africanization. Now, what I refer to as Africanization, you would most probably know as decolonization. And we've had a lot of, I don't know about in your country, but South Africa and other countries, South America specifically, they all talk about let's decolonize something. One of them is decolonize the country, the curriculum, the teaching processes, you know, and a lot of it is very destructive because it takes away what was built. And we in South Africa, from a historic perspective, you would see that a lot of buildings or statues, etc., has been removed. So all of those things holistically is often broadly referred to as decolonization. I don't see it that way. For me, I see the positive, the Africanization. That is about not removing one story and having no story. The Africanization is about showing all sides of the story when it comes to everything pertaining to Africa. As an African, and I see myself as an African, what is important is to ensure and know, first of all, that we can actively participate in changing the course of human knowledge. And the one way we can do it is to ensure that information about our countries, about our communities, about our places, about us as people, about our cultures, etc., are written up and made accessible by us and not by somebody from outside of our environment. I'm tired of Europeans telling me what I am, or as an African, or as a South African, I will tell them who I am. So that's why I say I'm talking about Africanization and not decolonization. Now, Africanization of research data management basically refers to, and the reason, sorry, let me give you this an example. The reason why most of the research data management plans or processes do not include Africanization as a key feature of why should you have data management is because they don't think about it. Which proves the very point, the very need for this. Because for Europe, America, and some of the other developed countries, we don't exist. And whatever we do is second class. That should not be the case. We can provide the evidence, and we can make sure that what we create, the research outputs, I'm talking about the journal articles, the theses, dissertations, everything that we create, together with research data, is made accessible online and freely accessible to anybody in the world, so that they can understand us as Africans, and they can that we can get the respect we need and the respect we should have from other countries. Sorry, I know that's a very politically laden approach, but I want to do away with the bias on the internet, because in the publishing industry, we know that 70, 80, 90% of journal articles are actually produced in the North, the global north. Yet, a lot of the information they use as part of the research comes from Africa, comes from South America, comes from other countries. I can't understand it. It is for me another form of exploitation that we sell our research. We don't sell it, sorry, let me rephrase. We give our research away to the global north, and then we pay back. We buy access back. So it's something I feel very strongly about, that we have to ensure that we put as many research output objects, and I'm talking about heritage objects, I'm talking about archival objects, etc., out there so that people can understand that we are not here to destroy, remove anything. We are merely putting ourselves out there as equal partners on the internet, and that people can find our information as easily as they can find information about Russia or America or whatever. I hope that answers Rahab's question. Oh, no, it's not, it wasn't Rahab, it was Alicia. Yes.
Sorry, thank you very much, Vandal. There's one more question. I don't know how brief you can summarize it from Rahab Kohej.
Yes.
She's asking about the legal framework for RDM's services in South Africa. I think in South Africa.
Yeah, we again, I think it's a very interesting question, and the reason is that you have different levels of entities that's involved in research. So your policies and guidelines for research data in South Africa is determined by the entity that you're talking to. So you'll have a research funder who's national that wants some form of compliance to a specific policy. One of those policies might be that if something is publicly funded, it should be in the public domain. But it's quite often the institution that actually has to come up with the policy locally that will, the policy and the guidelines. I think that, thank you for mentioning this, because I think there's a very clear distinction between policy and guideline. A policy is something enforceable. A guideline is merely a workflow process that's normally mapped out to support the policy. And I think it's good that you made a distinction, because also the policies are normally done at Senate level, for instance, where the guidelines are done at divisional level. But they need to be supportive of the mandate. And yes, we do have one that's still actually, we have gone live with our research data management tool 2 years ago, it's about 2 years ago, our repository, yet our policy has not been approved yet, because we keep on going back. And there's so many other policies that's impacting on this, copyright, I've mentioned some funding, etc., that it goes to Senate, then it comes back for consideration with some remarks to it. And I think the less policy you have and the more guideline you have, the luckier you'll be, because the more you push into policies, the more it will be questioned and returned, because, a Senate or the Council of the University only sits like 4 times a year. So thank you for that question. We do have, if you want to look at some excellent policies and guidelines, I suggest you actually look at Stellenbosch University. That's sun.ac.za in their library. They've gone a long route with policies and guidelines. So yes, that's one of the best I can think of. And then also Teresa. I'm going to put it in the chat box. Teresa. Then sun.ac.za. They are 2 key players in data in South Africa, data management.
Okay, that's very good. And I think, Van der Walt, you have been so helpful, and you have really touched the key points as far as data is concerned, and how librarians can get involved. Mine is just to alert every one of us that, remember, the Data Commission was just launched recently. I don't think if it's 2 years old in Kenya. And I know so much will be rolled around it, the development of policies and the legal framework around it. So please be on the watch out. And I think you might want just to be among the first people to take part in this. and ensure that our country is compliant to data policies and legal framework and has the best maybe within the region. I wish to take this opportunity to thank Van der Walt for his voluntary service that he has offered just to offer this training. And I think this opens the door for his wish to visit Kenya. Maybe this is now the first step for you visiting in Kenya at heart. And now you never know, maybe soon. Yeah. And this, maybe soon you'll be invited in the country. I wish also to take this opportunity to thank KLISC executive and the KLISC membership. Professor Kavulia was with us here. I think she has left, he has left for another commitment. Thank you very much for offering this opportunity. This is one of the endeavors of KLISC and one of the key options and activities that KLISC has rolled out to make sure that the new trends in library science are being picked up by librarians and are being fulfilled. And KLISC will be on the way forward to do all this. And for you all members who have managed to attend, thank you very much. I wish to appreciate you so much from the deepest point of my heart, because you decided to sacrifice some of the opportunities that you have so that you may have an opportunity to learn something, especially with regard to data. Otherwise, I want to thank you so much. Thank you so much. And may God bless you and may you have a wonderful time. Have a good evening. As those who are traveling back home, have a safe journey. Van der Walt, have a nice time and say hi to Dr. Mati, my supervisor.
I will do so.
Thank you very much, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.